What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Recently, I watched the X-Men movie Dark Phoenix, and while that movie was not very good, it did get me in the mood to watch and read some other X-Men stuff. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I overcommitted to something that I guarantee I'm going to regret, and I tried to watch and review all of the animated X-Men stuff. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do. I'll probably make it like 3 videos in before I give up on this little project. But I wanted to start with the 1989 pilot called Pryde of the X-Men, directed by Ray Lee and written by Larry Parr. The plot here is that Magneto is being transported via a great big convoy. And the Brotherhood of Mutants, composed of Toad, Emma Frost, the Juggernaut, Pyro, and Blob, they rescue Magneto. And meanwhile, Professor Xavier has sent a letter to Kitty Pryde, who is a young teenage girl who is just figuring out that she's a mutant. He tells her about the X-Men. They're all mutants. They live at his house, and they save the world from evil mutants like Magneto and his team. Magneto and the Juggernaut, they come to the school to steal the power circuit for Charles Xavier's mutant-finding device, Cerebro. And they are going to use this circuit to power a machine that is going to draw the Scorpio comet closer to Earth, and it's going to create a new ice age. Somehow, humanity will be wiped out, and mutants will be in charge of the planet. And then the X-Men go to stop Magneto from doing this. Kitty Pryde feels responsible because she was told to guard the circuit, and then Magneto stole it from her, so she feels responsible. So she goes up with the X-Men into outer space, and then she helps save the day. All throughout, Wolverine is giving Kitty Pryde a hard time, saying she's not an X-Man, she's just a little kid, she's just going to get in the way. And then Kitty Pryde kind of proves herself by the end by helping the X-Men save the day. So this pilot is renowned for being not great, and honestly, I think its reputation has kind of gotten ahead of it. I don't think it's as bad as a lot of people let on. There are some things about it that are incredibly silly. Wolverine inexplicably is Australian here. That's the big thing that a lot of people know about this, and yeah, that's a little goofy, but honestly, at this time, I don't think that Wolverine was the big character that he is today. This was before Barry Windsor Smith's Weapon X storyline that came out in, I think, 1991, and honestly, I think that is what made people like Wolverine even more than what they did in the late 80s. Yes, he was a big part of the X-Men during the 80s. All throughout the 80s, most of the characters who started in Giant Size X-Men issue 1 were gone by 89, but Wolverine stayed in the book throughout, so people did like the character, but I think they didn't like him as much as they do now, or they would a few years later when he would have his own ongoing series and the Weapon X storyline that was in Marvel Comics Presents. So making Wolverine Australian, a little bit of a weird choice, but I don't think that it's something that they necessarily thought was as big of a deal as what it ended up being to fans of the X-Men now. Also, we have the scene where the Brotherhood rescues Magneto. That is kind of similar to a scene where Magneto rescues Mystique, or attempts to, in X-Men The Last Stand. We have a group of mutants being transported via a great big convoy. And then you have other mutants who are rescuing those mutants. Very similar. I would be kind of surprised if the writing team and Brett Ratner had not seen the Pryde of the X-Men pilot, because this seems like they took that scene right from this pilot and then adapted it to the big screen. Changed it a little bit because here it's Magneto being rescued by his team, and there it's Magneto rescuing and forming a new team. But yeah, I feel like this is very similar to that. And then you've also got Magneto stealing something that's going to cause planetary devastation. This is kind of similar to a lot of Magneto's big villain plots, but really this reminded me the most of X-Men First Class, where Sebastian Shaw wants to cause a gigantic nuclear war that somehow mutants are going to inexplicably survive. Even though most mutants don't have the mutant ability to survive a nuclear holocaust, someone like Dazzler, loud noises give her the ability to shoot lasers from her hands, but she's still going to die from radiation. So that plot made absolutely no sense, in the same way that this plot doesn't really make any sense. Magneto wants to cause a new ice age that somehow all of the mutants are going to survive and humans are all going to die. This doesn't make any sense. Toad can jump around. That doesn't mean that he would survive a giant comet coming and crashing into the planet. Even if he's up in asteroid M when that happens, are any of these guys really prepared to be living in a planet where the climate has dropped like 50, 60 degrees or whatever? Like Emma Frost, look at what she's wearing. I don't think she's ready for a new ice age. So anyway, the basic plot of this is kind of garbage, but honestly, as a pilot, I think it does okay. I think they could have very easily stood to remove about half of the characters from this. You didn't need the Brotherhood of Mutants to be as huge as it was. In fact, you could have just had Magneto be the villain of this piece. You could have reworked the convoy scene a little bit. Maybe just remove the convoy scene and just have Magneto show up when Kitty Pryde is getting the tour of the mansion and he says, okay, I'm taking this circuit and I'm going to cause a big supervillain plan thing, and then just remove the Brotherhood of Mutants. Then you can focus a little bit more on Magneto as a character. Now, at this time, they probably weren't thinking, yeah, we're going to take a lot of the mature adult themes of the X-Men, like Magneto being a survivor of the Holocaust. We're going to take those and put them in this animated series that we hope to create. They probably weren't thinking that far ahead. They were probably just hoping maybe the network will pick this up and then we can do some stuff like that later on. But they probably weren't going to make Magneto as much of a nuanced character as he was in the comics at this time, because by 1989, Magneto was retconned as being an old friend of Charles Xavier and a survivor of the Holocaust, but they didn't get any of that here in this pilot. And I'm thinking, if you remove the nothing characters who don't really have anything to do, like all of the Brotherhood of Mutants, you could have focused a little bit more on Magneto. And the same with the X-Men. You've got a lot of X-Men here, and really only one or two of them actually get to do something. You could have had a team of like 3 X-Men maybe who go on this mission, and then you could say, yeah, there's some other X-Men, but some of them have retired, some of them are on another mission, or some of them are doing this and that. Maybe you could kind of bring in some of these other characters if you get picked up for a pilot. This thing really does a good job focusing on Kitty Pryde. She is scared and nervous. That picks up really well here, and that's something that makes a lot of sense. You've got a lot of teenage girls who joined the X-Men over the years. Jean Grey in X-Men issue 1, Kitty Pryde right after the Dark Phoenix saga, Jubilee eventually joins the team. A lot of that's kind of a recurring thing with the X-Men, and most of the time they look like they're drowning. They're in over their heads because this is a huge world that they're getting into, and I really like that aspect is brought to screen here. Also, I like most of the voice acting. Like I said, it's a little weird that Wolverine is Australian. The guy who played the psychiatrist in the first 3 Terminator movies, I can't remember the actor's name, but he actually voices Magneto. I was looking through the cast, and I didn't recognize most of the actors here, but I did recognize him. And also, Frank Welker does the voice of Toad. If you've never heard of Frank Welker, you've at least heard his characters before. He's been in a ton of cartoons, and so it was kind of neat seeing him here. Also, inexplicably, Lockheed is just hanging out on asteroid M. Like, Magneto doesn't like Lockheed. At one point, when they're getting ready to draw the comet to Earth, he's like, get out of the way, monster. And Lockheed is just there hanging out, and then when the X-Men go and they're about to leave, Kitty just takes Lockheed and they go. And I guess they were thinking, if this does get picked up to be a series, we have to have Lockheed here because everyone loves Lockheed, everyone loves Kitty Pryde, and those two are inseparable in the comics, so we have to have Lockheed. Let's just throw him on asteroid M, and that can be his origin story. That he doesn't really have an origin story, and it doesn't make any sense. So anyway, overall, I don't think that this is as awful as a lot of people give it credit for. I don't think that it's great. I think if you wanted to get a network interested in picking up the X-Men and making a series out of it, you really needed to focus more on a few characters. You don't need to just shove a whole bunch of X-Men characters onto the screen and say, look, isn't it cool Dazzler can shoot lasers out of her hands? Yeah, but what's her character like? And maybe I'm being a little bit unfair. We didn't get really good, nuanced, adult cartoons until like Batman the Animated Series, which was just a few years down the line. And actually, Jean McCurdy, she was a producer on this. She also was instrumental in getting Batman the Animated Series off the ground. But we didn't really have that at this time. You had anime at this time in the 80s that was a little bit more, I guess, loved by older audiences, but you didn't really have older teenage and adult audiences watching cartoons at this time. And I'm not saying that Batman the Animated Series is a mature audience's cartoon, but it does have more advanced, more I guess nuance is the word I keep coming back to, than something like Pryde of the X-Men. But I think if you want your network to care about this and you want them to create this thing, then what you need to do is get rid of most of the characters here. Just have Cyclops and Storm and maybe Dazzler or Wolverine, and then you can have Kitty Pryde be your point of view character. Have Magneto be the bad guy. You can have Professor X mention at one time, he was my dear friend, and then we both went down separate paths. He does mention that the Juggernaut is his stepbrother, so they're not afraid of using some of the continuity from the comics, but then some of it they don't delve into at all. And as we've seen over the last 20 years with the movies, the Charles Xavier Magneto dichotomy, that's kind of the basis of the X-Men. Yes, for the first 20 years of comic books, that wasn't a thing, but they did build a financially very successful and viable franchise out of that friendship and enemyship, if you will, in the live-action movies. So maybe that's something that they could have delved more into instead of Professor X casually dropping that the Juggernaut is his stepbrother. So anyway, I enjoyed this. It was interesting getting to see this. I am not really sure if we would have even gotten X-Men the Animated Series just a couple years later if it wasn't for Pryde of the X-Men. At the very least, the people who were making X-Men the Animated Series probably looked at Pryde of the X-Men and said, okay, this is what they did, and that did not get turned into a series, so we need to do something a little bit different. And they made a few different choices. They did have more adult themes. You had Beast kind of doing the silent protest where he's in jail and he refuses to be broken out of jail because he wants to try and protest things silently, and that's something that's fairly advanced for a children's cartoon of the early 90s. So at the very least, I think X-Men the Animated Series kind of looked at this and said, okay, we can do a little bit better. So I do think that historically, this animated pilot, even though it didn't get picked up itself, it is culturally important if you're a fan of X-Men the Animated Series. And even if you're not, I'm not really a fan of X-Men the Animated Series, but even if you're not, if it wasn't for that cartoon, we probably wouldn't have gotten any of the movies. And if we didn't get any of the movies, I probably wouldn't have ever started reading X-Men comics. So I do think that this is important. It's much more so than what people give it credit for. So that is my review of Pryde of the X-Men. Hopefully, I will be able to keep going, and I'll start talking about X-Men Animated Series in my next X-Men Animated video review. So with that, I will leave you guys with Storm and Wolverine having a little chat. See you next time.
Wolverine! Can't you see the girl is scared? Don't you remember what it was like when you first discovered you were a mutant?
Actually, Storm, I can't. You know that I have memory problems. It's kind of rude of you to bring that up, but okay.